The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 is remembered as the largest tank confrontation ever recorded, especially due to the clash at Prokhorovka and also as the most devastating day of aerial warfare. As part of Operation Citadel, the German High Command aimed to close a vast Soviet salient more than 80 kilometers deep. The strategy involved launching armored attacks from the flanks of the salient to encircle hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers, and thus reduce the length of the Eastern Front. Both the Axis and the Soviet Union concentrated their elite troops in the region. By early July, the Germans had assembled 43 divisions, but they faced a defensive wall made up of 100 Soviet divisions and 5 armored armies. By this point in the war, the USSR had already achieved overwhelming production and mobilization capacity, and Marshal Georgy Zhukov was prepared to trade men for enemy tanks. With the help of intelligence reports, Zhukov knew exactly when the German assault would begin. The Soviet response was to build the most colossal defensive system of the entire war, a network of minefields, pre-calculated artillery fire zones, and camouflaged anti-tank fortifications spread across 8 successive lines over 250 kilometers. Its purpose was to slow down the momentum of the panzer forces and wear them down before they reached the bulk of the Soviet troops, who had more than 3,000 tanks, mostly T-34 Model 76. On the German side, Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of the main architects of the offensive plan, and Colonel General Hermann Hoth, commanding the 4th Panzer Army, led the effort. Hoth was also supported by the 2nd Panzer Corps of the SS. Both generals were experienced veterans, but their disagreements with Adolf Hitler over the conduct of the war caused constant tensions. Von Manstein was dismissed in March 1944 and died in Bavaria in 1973, while Hoth died in Lower Saxony in 1971, both at the age of 85. In command of the SS was a loyal and feared general trusted by Hitler, Paul Hauser. Just 2 years earlier, Paul Hauser had been awarded the Knight's Cross, one of the highest honors of the Third Reich. Shortly afterward, on October 1st of the same year, he was promoted to the rank of SS Obergruppenführer. However, on October 14th, he was severely wounded in combat, resulting in the loss of his right eye. After a long recovery in May 1942, he returned to active service and was given command of the ISS Panzer Corps, composed of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, Das Reich and Totenkopf divisions. In early January 1943, this armored corps was deployed in the Kharkov sector on the Eastern Front. In February, it participated in the famous Third Battle of Kharkov, facing a strong Soviet offensive. With Tiger platoon units in its ranks, the Panzer Corps under Hauser's command took on the primary responsibility for defensive and maneuver operations in the area. During the battle, facing the possibility of being completely encircled by numerically superior enemy forces, Hauser made the decision to withdraw from Kharkov, defying a direct order from Hitler to hold the city at all costs. His move was risky but strategic. In March 1943, Hauser led a recovery offensive that allowed the city to be retaken, retroactively validating his decision to withdraw. While the Red Army and its strength thought they could quickly defeat their opponent, they soon found themselves in a critical situation, facing elite German formations from across the front. On the left flank, the Totenkopf division awaited them, in the center the Leibstandarte, while Das Reich commanded the right. The stage was set for an epic confrontation, the Waffen-SS against the elite armored forces of the Soviet Union. General Paul Hauser, commanding the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, had planned a continued advance toward Prokhorovka after the initial success at Kursk. On the night of July 11th, he issued orders for a traditional maneuver battle, planning the attack for the following day. The German forces quickly recognized the strong Soviet presence, which had numerous anti-tank guns positioned on the western slopes facing Prokhorovka. While they initially considered a direct assault by the Leibstandarte after thorough analysis, they understood that this would be impractical. As a result, a strategic plan was devised to begin the attack north of the Sel River. The Totenkopf divisions were to advance northeast toward the Kela-Prokhorovka road and then turn southeast to approach the Soviet positions in Prokhorovka from a flank and rear that would be advantageous. Thus, the 1st and 2nd SS Panzer divisions were ordered to wait patiently until the Totenkopf divisions initiated the offensive and produced negative effects on all Soviet positions in the sector. Once the Soviets in Prokhorovka were under pressure, the Leibstandarte was to join the fight, crossing the main Soviet defenses on the western slopes before reaching the city. Simultaneously, the Das Reich, located to the right of the Leibstandarte, was supposed to advance eastward, securing the heights south of Prokhorovka. Afterward, the Das Reich forces were to turn south, surrounding Prokhorovka in order to dismantle the Soviet line and open a gap in their defenses. Regarding air support, the 8th Air Corps of the Germans was to concentrate its main efforts on assisting the advance of the 2nd Panzer SS Corps. Meanwhile, the 48th Panzer Corps to the west received limited air resources for their operations. This meticulously coordinated plan sought to take advantage of the strengths of each division within the 2nd Panzer SS Corps, whose mission was to maximize the collective impact in this brutal confrontation. However, an unexpected move would occur. To the surprise of General Paul Hauser of the Waffen-SS, during the night of July 11th to 12th, Soviet Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmístrov took strategic action by moving his elite force, the 5th Guards Tank Army, to a meeting area located just south of Prokhorovka. This maneuver was a crucial step that prepared a significant armored assault for the following day. Unbeknownst to the Germans, the sound of rumbling tank engines echoed in the night as the 18th and 29th Tank Corps mobilized and positioned themselves in their respective assembly areas to the east. The stage was set for a significant confrontation, with Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army ready to launch a major armored offensive against the unsuspecting German forces. On July 11th, the commander of the Voronezh front, Nikolai Vatutin, issued an order for the armies of that front to launch an offensive the following day, forming the southern component of a broader Soviet offensive. In a strategic maneuver, the Steppe front, which included the 5th Guards Tank Army, was deployed from reserve to confront and dismantle the advancing German forces. The 5th Army received much-needed support from the infantry of the 69th Army. The battle advanced, and the assault was reinforced by 5 artillery regiments, an artillery brigade, and an artillery division. To the south of the 5th Guards Tank Army, the 2nd Guards Tank Corps was tasked with attacking the positions held by the Das Reich Division. Positioned as reserves to the north of Prokhorovka, the 5th Mechanized Guards Corps awaited further orders. Meanwhile, Commander Rotmístrov ordered his tank armies to rapidly advance with the firm intention of confronting the German armored forces at high speed and neutralizing the advantages of the enemy's Ferdinand and Tiger tanks, particularly in range and firepower. Rotmístrov was completely confident that the agility of the T-34s would allow them to close the distance quickly and thus achieve effective flank shots against the heavy German tanks. However, complications arose that Rotmístrov had not anticipated. Upon discovering the presence of the Leibstandarte in the areas designated for his forces, he had no choice but to correct his orders, instructing his men to adapt to the circumstances that the battlefield demanded. The imminent clash at Prokhorovka was marked by the dynamic and ever-changing nature of both sides' strategic dispositions. In the final hours of July 12th, Soviet command received truly alarming reports from intelligence, warning that German forces had successfully crossed the northern Donets River at Rzhev, seriously threatening Rotmistrov's carefully planned strategy. This development severely compromised the flank of the 5th Guards Tank Army and required immediate action. On the morning of July 12th, Commander Vatutin was furious. He couldn't understand why his men were unable to stop the German forces' advance. He quickly ordered Rotmístrov to send reinforcements to strengthen the Soviet forces facing the 3rd Panzer Corps. In response to Vatutin's directive, Rotmístrov wasted no time and swiftly organized a task force. The Soviet men tasked with following Vatutin's orders were from the 26th Tank Brigade of the 2nd Guards Tank Corps, the 11th and 12th Guards Mechanized Brigades of the 5th Guards Mechanized Corps, and the 50th Guards Tank Regiment of the 5th Guards Tank Army. Additional reserve units also joined as the group advanced south. Notably, Rotmístrov committed more than half of his reserves to this critical, improvised advance, deploying them strategically at the outset of the Battle of Prokhorovka. At the same time, Vatutin, recognizing the gravity of the situation, concentrated the efforts of the Red Air Force against the 40th Panzer Corps to the west. This air support assignment aimed to counter the threat posed by the German forces in that sector, highlighting the dynamic and adaptable nature of the Soviet response to evolving challenges. At 6 in the morning, reports from the Leibstandarte reached headquarters, notifying them of their own advance and the imminent Soviet response. Tension increased noticeably, and the battlefield braced for the worst. The Soviets initiated a brief but intense artillery bombardment between 6 and 6:15. Nearly 20 minutes later, when the final shells reverberated across the battlefield, Rotmístrov transmitted the coded words, "Steel, steel, steel," signaling the decisive order to begin the attack. Following Rotmistrov's commanding order, the armoured forces of the 5th Guards Tank Army advanced, marking the official start of their determined attack on the German positions. This action marked the official beginning of the Battle of Prokhorovka. Descending the western slopes leading up to Prokhorovka, a powerful Soviet armoured group composed of 5 tank brigades entered combat. The 29th and 18th Tank Corps led the charge with their T-34 and T-70 tanks, advancing swiftly and unleashing their firepower as they neared their objective. Each of the 5 armoured brigades approaching the Leibstandarte positions had a formidable arsenal, composed of between 60 and 65 tanks per brigade. Surprisingly, while the Soviet tanks manoeuvred along the corridor toward the German lines, they carried soldiers from the 9th Parachute Division on their decks. This collaboration demonstrated a multifaceted assault combining the speed and firepower of tanks with the presence of ground troops ready to spring into action. Approximately 500 tanks and self-propelled guns formed the vanguard of this massive and turbulent offensive, advancing in 2 major waves. The first wave included 430 tanks, while the second followed closely behind with another 70. The magnitude and coordination of this assault underscored the determination and strategic planning employed by the Soviet forces in their attempt to break through the German defenses and alter the course of the Battle of Prokhorovka. Fatigued and exhausted from the previous combats, the Leibstandarte troops were caught off guard as they did not expect an immediate resumption of hostilities and anticipated a break until later in the day. This element of surprise significantly affected their preparedness and response to the imminent threat. A battalion of the 2nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment SS of the Leibstandarte was strategically positioned on the reverse slope of Hill 252.2, a position secured the previous day. At the foot of this hill lay a Soviet anti-tank trench, adding an additional defensive challenge for the German forces. The German forces, overwhelmed by the enemy's response, moved to their positions. From a distance, they could see hundreds of Soviet armored vehicles heading directly towards them. At that moment, it was do or die. As the Soviet offensive unfolded, the German advanced posts raised the alert by firing purple flares, signaling an imminent massive tank assault. This visual signal quickly spread across the front, lighting up the sky with colorful flashes. Obersturmführer Rudolf von Ribbentrop, in command of the 2nd Battalion of the 1st Panzer SS Regiment, recognized the gravity of the situation and understood that a large attack was underway. In response, he quickly ordered his company of 7 Panzer IVs to mobilize. Crossing an improvised bridge over the anti-tank trench, they deployed on the lower slope of Hill 252.2. Meanwhile, at the top of the hill, Officer Joachim Peiper and his Panzer Grenadier SS, with their armoured half-tracks, faced an overwhelming assault, being outnumbered by the advancing Soviet forces. As Ribbentrop's tanks deployed on the lower slope, he observed the scene unfolding on the hill. According to his own testimony, "In front of me there appeared 15 tanks, then 20, then 30, and finally 40 tanks. In the end, there were too many to count. The T-34s were coming toward us at high speed, carrying mounted infantry. The unexpectedly overwhelming nature of the Soviet advance posed a formidable challenge to the Leibstandarte defenses, thus setting the stage for a crucial and intense battle on Hill 252.2. As the Soviet tanks descended the western slope of the hill, an intense and fierce battle erupted. The confrontation escalated quickly. A Panzer IV on Ribbentrop's right flank burst into flames. Chaos swept through the battlefield and the Soviet tanks rolled over the German lines. The battlefield scene was entirely new for the Leibstandarte, which had yet to experience such an unfavorable scenario throughout the war. The men inside the panzers were suffocated by the heat and smoke. The field was filled with incessant cries and panic over all radio transmissions. The panzers knew that if this Soviet offensive was not stopped soon, they would not leave the Soviet steppe alive. The moving Soviet tanks unleashed a barrage of fire, although their high speed compromised their accuracy. Rotmístrov's tactic of closing in quickly not only exerted immense pressure on the German forces, but also disrupted their cohesion. The control and coordination of the Soviet tank formations turned the battlefield dynamics into a whirlwind of maneuvering tanks and blistering artillery fire. Soviet intelligence had significantly overestimated the number of Ferdinands and Tigers within the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. In reality, there were no Ferdinands with the 4th Panzer Army, as they were all deployed to the north with the 9th Army. Among the 3 divisions of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, only 15 Tiger tanks were available, with 10 positioned north of the Sel River alongside the Totenkopf divisions. The Leibstandarte had only 4 operational Tigers, while Das Reich had just 1. The stark contrast between the anticipated and actual numbers further complicated the battle dynamics, revealing the strategic errors of Soviet intelligence. The shortage of heavy German tanks in this sector was keenly felt during the ongoing struggle for control of Hill 252.2. On the far right, the situation was no better. As the battle unfolded across the vast battlefield southwest of Prokhorovka, the confrontation between Das Reich and Soviet forces grew increasingly intense. Das Reich launched its assault from a strategic position several kilometers away, aiming to push deeper into enemy territory and help relieve Leibstandarte. The chaotic and intense nature of the confrontation became evident as the aggressive battle groups of the 2nd Soviet Tank Corps and the 2nd Guards Tank Corps collided with the forward units of Das Reich. The German regiments, well-equipped and highly trained, faced strong and violent opposition from Soviet forces, each consisting of 20 to 40 tanks, supported by infantry and ground attack aircraft. The thunderous roar of tank engines, sharp gunfire, and deafening artillery shell explosions created a cacophony of war that echoed across the vast expanse of the battlefield. The clash between Das Reich and the Soviet elite units of armored vehicles and infantry turned the landscape into a swirling chaos of dust, smoke, and the stench of burning metal. The Soviet forces, determined to defend their positions, launched fierce counterattacks against the advancing German divisions. The tanks maneuvered with agility, seeking advantageous positions, while infantry units fought fiercely in trenches and open fields. Das Reich, recognizing the gravity of the situation, responded with coordinated tactics and strategic maneuvers. The German tank crews demonstrated their skill and precision, engaging in deadly duels with their Soviet counterparts. The battle groups of the Das Reich regiments, facing relentless siege, displayed resilience and adaptability, adjusting their formations to respond to the ever-changing dynamics of the battlefield. Meanwhile, the left flank of the battlefield was a hellish chaos. A parallel struggle unfolded as elements of the 1st Soviet Tank Army attempted to crush the Totenkopf bridgehead. The SS Totenkopf division proved to be a significant obstacle, successfully repelling repeated assaults by the 10th and 31st Tank Corps. Additionally, elements from the 33rd Rifle Corps supported the Soviet forces in their attempt to combat the Totenkopf bridgehead. The battlefield on the left flank turned into a scene of intense clashes, with the distinct sound of tank tracks and artillery fire reverberating across the terrain. Despite the persistent Soviet efforts, the Totenkopf Panzer Group showed unwavering resistance and determination. The SS division not only held its position, but also advanced steadily toward a critical road leading from the village of Katucheva. This road, which stretched southeast crossing the river, had strategic importance as it led directly to Prokhorovka. Totenkopf's calculated movement toward this key route indicated their intention to play a crucial role in the ongoing battle dynamics at Prokhorovka. The division sought to secure and control this vital path, thereby influencing the flow of reinforcements and supplies both to the bridgehead and to the wider front lines. The advance of the Soviet armored units encountered a significant obstacle at the base of Hill 252.2. Upon reaching the formidable anti-tank trench now in German hands, some vehicles collided with the deep trench, while others maneuvered cautiously along its edge, searching for a viable crossing point. Intense exchanges of fire erupted between Soviet artillery and the 2 remaining companies of the 1st Panzer SS Battalion, located on the other side of the trench. Amid this engagement, Soviet tanks sought a way to cross the obstacle. Simultaneously, as the first waves of Soviet tanks passed, the surviving Panzer Grenadiers under Joachim Peiper's command emerged from the trench lines. Their mission was to confront the Soviet paratroopers and counter the Russian tanks using magnetic-shaped charges. The clash intensified, and the German forces mourned the loss of 20 half-tracks from the battalion during the fight. Some of these vehicles were destroyed as they tried to ram the much heavier Russian tanks, a desperate effort to prevent them from wreaking havoc on the company. Meanwhile, dozens of soldiers engaged in close-quarter combat with hundreds of Soviet paratroopers in the trenches. At this stage, the fighting was brutal and fierce. Knives, shovels, and any sharp object that could kill were used. The deafening roar of the tanks and the martial rhythm of the Soviet infantry echoed in the air. The first shots rang out, marking the start of a brutal period of close combat. The Soviets descended upon the German forces with a ferocity that drove the enemy to despair. The numbers seemed endless. Chaos erupted as bayonets clashed, and thousands of fists flew. From a distance, the cries of the wounded could be heard, blending with the savage roars of battle. The acrid smell of gunpowder and sweat filled the air of the combat zone. Neither side was willing to lose control. The blows never ceased, and fatigue was even greater. Every passing minute felt like a new push toward death, but no one knew who would be next. Blood soaked the ground and everything around it. The earth turned into a muddy battlefield, a reflection of the men fighting for both Germany and the Soviet Union. As the day wore on, the struggle became a test of endurance, with the ebb and flow of the battle shifting. Soldiers staggered, and exhaustion threatened to overcome them. In the effort to avoid leaving their forces at a disadvantage, even the wounded continued the fight. Over the battlefield, the 2nd and 17th Soviet air armies made around 900 sorties, surpassing the core of the German Luftwaffe, which carried out just over 650 sorties over the southern part of the salient. Notably, the majority of the Soviet sorties that day were directed at the 48th Panzer Corps to the west and the 3rd Panzer Corps to the south. Despite the larger total number of Soviet sorties, the Luftwaffe maintained air superiority over the Prokhorovka battlefield. However, the effectiveness of the aerial operations was hampered by low clouds in the morning and storms in the afternoon, affecting both sides. In the skies over Prokhorovka, the Luftwaffe exerted unmatched dominance, deploying formidable formations of Stukas that unleashed chaos over the battlefield. Among these aerial predators were the experimental G2 variants, equipped with the powerful 3.7-centimeter BK-37 cannons, led by the skilled squadron leader, Captain Hans Ulrich Rudel. The relentless efficiency of these aircraft was amplified by the constant presence of FW-190 fighter bombers and HS-129 ground attack planes armed with potent 3-centimeter anti-tank cannons. This lethal combination ruthlessly attacked Soviet formations, particularly devastating the 31st Tank Brigade. As the storm of enemy artillery and airstrikes rained down on them, the Tank Brigade suffered heavy losses, with their armor succumbing to the destructive power of the German air assault. Despite their brave efforts to advance and reach the Command Mole State Farm at 10:30, the relentless waves of airstrikes prevented further progress, forcing the brigade to adopt a defensive posture. The continuous lack of air cover exacerbated their difficulties, leaving them vulnerable to the merciless aerial assault. The 5th Guards Tank Army faced similar challenges. They quickly reported that hundreds of enemy aircraft remained over their formations throughout the battle. In contrast, their own aviation, particularly the fighter planes, was deemed insufficient for effective defense. The role of air power in shaping the Battle of Prokhorovka was evident, with both sides struggling with the complexities of aerial operations under adverse weather conditions. Werner Wolf, the unexpected hero. During the fierce fighting, Werner Wolf, an Obersturmführer of the SS belonging to the Leibstandarte, earned the Iron Cross First Class for his actions during the Russian assault on Hill 250.2. Approximately 150 enemy tanks were heading towards his company, and the original commander was killed. But Wolf took command of the leaderless company, quickly organizing a defensive line and deploying anti-tank teams to save his comrades from destruction. His actions laid the foundation for a resilient defense. Wolf not only restored the fighting spirit of the exhausted grenadiers, but also instilled an unshakable resolve that withstood the hostile assault. His leadership symbolized resilience, confronting and neutralizing a T-34 in hand-to-hand combat, killing the enemy commander in a struggle with his dagger. Wolf's actions were crucial in turning the tide of adversity and creating a defense that would halt the Soviet advance. Back on the Leibstandarte field, the battle continued with the arrival of new Soviet tanks. Among the defenders was tank commander Michael Wittmann, leading a platoon of 3 Tigers. They steadily advanced through the chaos, navigating through flames and smoke from burning grass, approaching the T-34s. Michael's voice came over the radio, urgency in his tone. "Attention! A substantial force of enemy tanks is approaching ahead. Many tanks." The crew prepared as 25 Soviet tanks from the 181st Tank Brigade appeared, initially disappearing into a valley before reappearing on a rise. Faced with this dangerous threat, Wittmann calmly assessed the situation. The Tigers, as experienced veterans, adjusted their position to confront the approaching Soviet tanks. The clash unfolded with a series of calculated movements, each side fighting for control in an ever-changing war theater. The air was tense, but Wittmann's leadership and the tactical maneuvers of his Tiger platoon would determine the outcome of this ongoing battle on the field. But it didn't end there. Commanding a group of 15 Soviet tanks, the Soviet captain led a T-34 in a determined advance toward Wittmann's platoon, shouting orders. He urged his comrades from the different tank divisions to advance. "Follow me!" In response, Wittmann's Tigers fired back with 2 well-aimed shots, striking the captain's tank. The exchange took its toll, leaving the captain severely wounded and forcing his crew to hastily rescue him from the burning T-34. Amidst the chaos, the driver of the T-34, undeterred, climbed back into the tank, turning it into a flaming spectacle as it advanced. This burning T-34 descended upon the SS Staff Sergeant's Tiger, creating a dramatic and dangerous confrontation on the battlefield. The close-quarters combat highlighted the intense dynamics of tank warfare during the Battle of Prokhorovka, where skill, strategy, and quick reactions played a pivotal role in determining the outcome of this hellish battle. In his account of the battle, the Staff Sergeant vividly described the intense moments on the battlefield. He recounted, "Suddenly, about 50 enemy tanks charged at us in a reversed wedge formation, using small forests and hedgerows for cover. The Russian tanks were advancing at full speed, seemingly intent on fighting at close quarters. To compensate for our superior armor and armament, the battle order broke apart under the onslaught. A Tiger was hit at point-blank range and caught fire. Amid the chaos, I managed to destroy 2 T-34s, one of which was advancing toward me, engulfed in flames. At the last moment, I skillfully dodged that fiery threat, a moving bomb." However, despite the devastating losses, the Soviets showed remarkable perseverance, maintaining an unrelenting and continuous pressure on the battlefield. The tumultuous ebb and flow of the battle stretched from the northern confines to the southern expanse. Leibstandarte's efforts to advance faced formidable opposition, with Soviet tank groups and infantry clashing in a fierce back-and-forth struggle. The 1st Panzer Regiment, encountering determined Soviet resistance, could not advance and had to retreat before 6 p.m. Simultaneously, the 181st Soviet Tank Brigade, reinforced by the 175th Tank Brigade, emerged as a potent threat, with the potential to sever the connection between Leibstandarte and Tuów in the strategic village of Vasileva. At this moment, the Leibstandarte Grenadiers were battling against an overwhelming onslaught of Soviet tanks and mounted infantry. The relentless and dynamic nature of the conflict highlighted the tenacity of both sides as they fiercely contested control during this crucial phase of the Borova battle. The battlefield, stretching across the vast expanse from Oktaby to Storoy, was as intense as ever. The noise was deafening as usual, people shouting and overwhelming brutality. A crew member of a tank destroyer offered a vivid recollection of the relentless assault, encapsulating the terrifying experience with these words, "Salvo after salvo from Stalin's organs fell upon our positions with artillery and mortars in between. T-34 after T-34 rolled downhill 3, 5, 10. But what good was counting?" This moving description vividly portrayed the overwhelming and constant barrage of Soviet artillery and tank attacks. At a crucial moment in the battle, Soviet tanks managed to break through the defenses, advancing toward Kolet and presenting a direct threat to Leibstandarte's command post. The subsequent confrontation led to close-quarters combat between enemy tanks and the artillery regiment of Leibstandarte, emphasizing the intense and dangerous proximity of the armored clash. By the end of the afternoon, heavy rains broke the sky, and the rain sizzled over the smoking remains of tank carcasses scattered across the battlefield. The roads, now transformed into quagmires, added to the already difficult conditions. In the sector occupied by the 29th and 18th Tank Corps, the fighting came to a halt. Both sides were completely exhausted by the grueling trial of the battle, unable to sustain further offensive actions. The relentless fighting, combined with the adverse weather and deteriorating battlefield conditions, brought a temporary cessation to the fierce struggle in this sector of the Battle of Prokhorovka. As July 12th, the Day of Hell, came to an end, Leibstandarte, with tremendous determination, successfully retained control of Hill 22.2, holding firm against the relentless assault of the 5 brigades of the 5th Guards Tank Army. The division's resistance to the formidable Soviet offensive was truly remarkable. Their steadfast commitment and formidable defensive capabilities remained solid despite the intense fighting required to repel the onslaught. Leibstandarte did not yield an inch of ground to the Soviets that day. However, the cost of this hard-won victory was high. The division emerged from the battlefield physically and mentally exhausted, bearing the scars of a brutal and fierce encounter. The cost of the relentless conflict, both on the soldiers and the war machinery, underscored the magnitude of the challenges Leibstandarte faced to maintain control of Hill 22.2. Meanwhile, Totenkopf achieved a notable triumph by capturing Hill 26.6, marking a significant success in the development of the Battle of Prokhorovka. At the same time, their panzer group made remarkable progress, advancing along the northern bank of the Sel River, eventually reaching the Kartasheva-Prokhorovka road approximately 8 kilometers northwest of Prokhorovka. Although Totenkopf's control over the newly acquired territory was somewhat precarious, the division was strategically positioned to potentially execute a flanking maneuver against the Soviet forces entrenched in Prokhorovka. This change in position not only added a layer of complexity to the battlefield dynamics, but also opened new and promising possibilities for Totenkopf, as the Germans still had a potential opportunity to capture the city of Prokhorovka. The strategic importance of reaching the Kartasheva-Prokhorovka road highlighted Totenkopf's ability to influence the course of the battle. The potential for a surrounding maneuver demonstrated the division's tactical cunning as Totenkopf stood at the crossroads of opportunity. Although the division was vastly outnumbered, they somehow managed to emerge with the possibility of winning this battle. On the far right, the Das Reich faced relentless pressure from the 2nd Guards Tank Corps and the 2nd Tank Corps, forcing it to adopt a defensive stance. The division had to abandon its initially planned offensive maneuver, and its panzer group was limited to launching counterattacks against the advancing Soviet armor. This strategic shift highlighted the formidable challenges that Das Reich faced in dealing with the intense Soviet offensive during the ongoing Battle of Prokhorovka. The unyielding push from the Soviet Tank Corps forced Das Reich to reassess its approach and switch from an offensive to a defensive posture. The inability to execute the planned maneuver emphasized the adaptability required in response to the ever-changing battlefield conditions. Das Reich's panzer group, now relegated to launching counterattacks, faced the daunting task of repelling the advancing Soviet forces. This change in strategy and the defensive posture adopted by Das Reich painted a vivid picture of the complex and fluid nature of the Battle of Prokhorovka. The division, facing overwhelming pressure from the Soviet tanks, demonstrated the adaptability and resilience needed to confront a formidable adversary on the Eastern Front. The ongoing conflict evolved into a test of strategic ingenuity and tactical flexibility in the relentless struggle for control. The 5th Guards Tank Army suffered significant and severe losses in armored units during the Battle of Prokhorovka. The initial Soviet offensive push was met with effective resistance, forcing Rotmístrov to strategically shift his command from an offensive to a defensive posture. The high cost suffered by Soviet armor underscored the ferocity and steep price of the confrontation, leading to a re-evaluation of strategies as both sides adjusted to the changing dynamics of the battle. The battlefield witnessed considerable losses in Soviet forces, indicative of the intense resistance they encountered. In response to the formidable challenges and losses, Rotmístrov made the calculated decision to adopt a defensive posture, emphasizing the need to regroup and fortify their positions. The shift in strategy reflected the adaptability required in response to the evolving circumstances on the Prokhorovka battlefield. On the night of July 12th, Soviet commander Vatutin issued orders directing forces facing the 2nd Panzer Corps of the SS and the 3rd Panzer Corps to adopt a defensive stance the following day. The 1st Tank Army and the 6th Guards, along with the 32nd Guards Rifle Corps of the 5th Guards Army, were instructed to persist in their offensive actions against the 48th Panzer Corps. Simultaneously, the Red Air Force received directives to concentrate its efforts on attacking the 3rd Panzer Corps. The orders issued from the 2nd Panzer Corps of the SS for July 13th outlined the objectives for Totenkopf, requiring the division to consolidate its gains from the previous day and then launch an attack across the Pel River on the northwestern flank of the Soviet forces surrounding Prokhorovka. Leibstandarte was ordered to fortify its front line and coordinate an attack on Prokhorovka from the south, aligning with Totenkopf's offensive from the northwest. Meanwhile, the Das Reich forces were tasked with consolidating and reinforcing their front line in preparation for an offensive operation intended to link up with the 3rd Panzer Corps. These strategic directives outlined the coordinated efforts and objectives of both the Soviet and German forces for the crucial day of July 13th, shaping the tactical landscape of the Battle of Prokhorovka. In the early hours of July 13th, the Soviet forces initiated a strong reconnaissance action against Totenkopf, a move that would define the events of the day. As the day progressed, this initial action evolved into localized counterattacks led by the 5th Guards Mechanized Corps and the 33rd Rifle Corps. These counterattacks had a strategic focus on Totenkopf's left flank, aiming to disrupt the German division's plans, particularly their planned southern offensive against Soviet positions in Prokhorovka. This was a significant development. First-hand accounts from the battlefield vividly reflected the intensity of the clashes as Soviet units faced off against Totenkopf in reconnaissance missions and subsequent counterattacks. The dynamic nature of the confrontation was prominently manifested on Totenkopf's left flank. The localized Soviet counterattacks demonstrated their commitment to disrupting the German offensive by any means necessary. Around midday, Leibstandarte received urgent orders to launch an attack northward, advancing toward the Pel River west of Prokhorovka. The goal was to consolidate their front line with Totenkopf's positions. However, this offensive encountered formidable challenges as it came up against heavily fortified defensive positions held by the 33rd Guards Rifle Corps, reinforced by the remnants of the 18th and 29th Tank Corps. The strategic maneuver to consolidate the front line with Totenkopf's positions faced fierce opposition. Soviet defenses during this critical phase were too entrenched, and at that moment Leibstandarte lacked enough heavy tanks to break through the defense. That afternoon, Totenkopf received orders to abandon the narrow and increasingly vulnerable salient to the northwest of Prokhorovka and withdraw to more defensible positions along the northern bank of the Pel River. Despite persistent Soviet efforts to cut off the salient and hinder Totenkopf's retreat, the division managed to complete its withdrawal by nightfall. The strategic decision to abandon the exposed salient was crucial to reposition and secure stronger defensive lines along the Pel River. Accounts from the field detailed the challenges Totenkopf faced while navigating Soviet attempts to disrupt their retreat. Nevertheless, the successful completion of the division's withdrawal highlighted their strategic agility and ability to adapt to the ever-changing dynamics of the battle. The end of Operation Citadel marks a crack. On this day, July 13th, Hitler issued urgent orders to end Operation Citadel, marking a crucial decision in the development of this battle. The German High Command welcomed this decision, as it was already in the process of withdrawing units from the 9th Army from the Kursk salient to face the growing Soviet offensives. On the other hand, Erich von Manstein, the German commander, expressed deep disappointment with the decision. He argued that his forces were on the verge of a significant breakthrough. The 3rd Panzer Corps was about to link up with the 2nd SS Panzer Corps in Prokhorovka, and the operational reserve, the 24th Panzer Corps, was ready to enter the fray. Manstein contended that halting the offensive at this critical moment, when victory seemed within reach, was a missed opportunity. Despite his pleas, Adolf Hitler, focused on the Western Front, was unwilling to prolong the offensive. Sticking to his argument, von Manstein proposed continuing the offensive operations in the southern Kursk salient to destroy the Soviet reserves before finally ending Operation Citadel. This strategic move aimed to exhaust the Soviet fighting capacity in the sector for the remainder of the summer. Eventually, Hitler agreed to Manstein's proposal, accepting the extension of the offensive operations in the southern salient until the German commander's objective was achieved. This episode highlighted the strategic differences and debates within the German High Command, with von Manstein advocating for continuing the offensive to capitalize on potential successes, while Adolf Hitler, considering broader priorities, initially opted to halt Operation Citadel. Aware of the urgency of the situation and the imminent loss of the SS Panzer Corps, Manstein quickly formulated plans for Operation Roland. Recognizing the limited time available, he orchestrated a strategy that was to be executed within a few days. The core of the plan involved Das Reich launching an attack to the east and south with the objective of linking up with the 3rd Panzer Corps, which was advancing simultaneously to the northwest. Leibstandarte and Totenkopf were assigned to anchor the left and northern flanks of Das Reich in this coordinated maneuver. The ultimate goal was to achieve a crucial link that would encircle the Soviet forces in the process, anticipating that weakening the Soviet defense would lead to the imminent fall of Prokhorovka. The overall goal of Operation Roland was to annihilate the Soviet armored reserve concentrated in the southern sector of the Kursk salient. In doing so, the operation aimed to effectively frustrate the Soviet offensives for the remainder of the summer. Von Manstein's strategic vision sought to seize this critical opportunity to alter the dynamics of the Eastern Front and secure a significant advantage for the German forces engaged in the battles of Prokhorovka and Kursk. The directives for Operation Roland were issued in the late hours of July 14, 1943. However, after a meeting between Hitler and von Manstein, Hitler revoked the deployment of the 24th Panzer Corps to the Kursk salient, redirecting them on July 14th to support the 1st Panzer Army to the south. The beginning of Operation Roland. The assault for Operation Roland began at 400 hours on July 15th, following a brief artillery barrage. The Panzer Grenadier Regiment of Das Reich initiated the offensive, advancing towards the elevation to the southwest. In intense house-to-house and close-quarters combat, they drove the remnants of the 2nd Guards Tank Corps from the town of Belino. The Panzer Regiment of the division successfully repelled a series of counterattacks, destroying several T-34s in the process. The Soviets were forced to retreat eastward, prompting Zhukov to order elements of the 10th Guards Mechanized Brigade in reserve to reinforce the position to the south. The 7th Panzer Division established contact with the Das Reich divisions. However, Trufanov, commander of the Soviet forces in the Gap, was aware of the threat and conducted a fighting withdrawal. Although the Soviets had to abandon a considerable number of anti-tank guns, the link did not manage to encircle a substantial portion of the Soviet forces. Operation Roland did not result in a decisive or positive outcome for the German forces. According to orders issued late on July 15th, Totenkopf began a withdrawal from its positions north of the Pell River, while the 2nd SS Panzer Corps assumed a defensive posture. The result of Operation Roland highlighted the challenges and complexities faced by the German forces in their attempts to change the course of the battle. On July 17th, the Soviet southwestern and southern fronts launched a significant offensive, crossing the Mius and Donetsk rivers and targeting the southern flank of Army Group South. The offensive exerted pressure on the 6th Army and the 1st Panzer Army. Early in the afternoon of that same day, Operation Roland was officially ended with an order for the 2nd SS Panzer Corps to begin withdrawing from the Prokhorovka sector toward Belgorod. The 4th Panzer Army and the Kempf detachment had anticipated this order and began executing the withdrawal starting the night of July 16th. The tanks of Leibstandarte were redistributed between Das Reich and Totenkopf, and the division was quickly relocated to Italy. Meanwhile, Das Reich and Totenkopf were sent south to face the new Soviet offensive, redirecting their focus from the Prokhorovka sector to the southern front. This marked the conclusion of Operation Roland and the Battle of Prokhorovka, signaling a significant strategic shift in response to the evolving military landscape. German forces, facing challenges on multiple fronts, adjusted their deployments to counter the growing Soviet pressure in the south. In conclusion, determining the losses in the Battle of Prokhorovka is challenging for both sides. The losses of German tanks are subject to variation, partly due to the approach taken to count and report equipment losses. This means that recoverable and repairable equipment was categorized differently from irreparable or abandoned equipment, which influences the reported figures. The complexities of the situation add difficulties to the task of establishing accurate tank loss statistics for the Germans. Similarly, obtaining reliable figures on Soviet tank and personnel casualties in the Battle of Prokhorovka is also complicated. The dynamic and intense nature of the conflict, combined with the challenges of documentation during wartime, contributed to the ambiguity surrounding casualty figures for the Soviet side. Essentially, the fog of war, differing counting methodologies, and the fluid conditions on the battlefield made it arduous to pinpoint exact and complete loss figures on both sides during the Battle of Prokhorovka. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps reported 843 casualties, including killed, wounded, or missing personnel. Notably, while the Germans maintained control of the Prokhorovka battlefield until July 17th, they were able to recover most of their damaged armored vehicles during this period. Specific German archival data for the 2nd SS Panzer indicated a loss of 3 to 5 tanks on July 12th. Detailed records revealed that Leibstandarte suffered 3 tank losses in the battle. These included 2 Panzer IVs and 1 Tiger. The other 2 divisions reported operational forces of over 120 tanks and assault guns, respectively, by the end of July 16th. Demonstrating a remarkable to maintain tank operational strength, with the 2nd SS Panzer nearly reaching the same number of operational tanks it had at the start of the Battle of Prokhorovka. Further analysis of divisional reports indicated that the SS Panzer Corps had 294 operational panzers and assault guns on July 12th, decreasing to 251 on July 13th, considering the possibility of some repaired tanks being introduced that day. It was estimated that at least 43 SS Panzer vehicles became inoperable during the Battle of Prokhorovka. Notably, this figure included the 10 Tigers belonging to the Totenkopf division and 1 belonging to Leibstandarte. But all inoperable Tiger tanks were considered repairable, with none being written off. The general estimate suggests that between 60 and 80% of the SS Panzer armored vehicles became inoperable during the intense combat on July 12th. In addition to the ground forces, the German air forces, namely the Luftwaffe, reported significant damage to aircraft on July 12th, with a total of 11 planes damaged, 6 of which were categorized as total losses, all attributed to Soviet anti-aircraft fire. This comprehensive assessment provided insights into the material and personnel losses suffered by the 2nd SS Panzer Corps during the critical day of the Battle of Prokhorovka. The exact Soviet losses for July 12th are not known with precision, but military historians have provided estimates. On one hand, it was estimated that personnel casualties at Prokhorovka reached around 5,500 men. Regarding equipment losses, it was estimated that the 5th Guards Tank Army lost at least 400 tanks from its inventory of over 800 during the attacks on July 12th. Another estimate suggests a higher range, placing armored losses between 600 and 650 tanks. Other historians estimated the initial strength of the 5th Guards Tank Army at around 300 tanks and self-propelled guns. A report prepared by the headquarters of the 5th Guards Tank Army on July 17, 1943, summarized the combat losses suffered by the formation between July 12th and 16th, including divisions, brigades, and other smaller units directly subordinated to the Army's headquarters. The document reported the following irrevocable losses: 574 heavy and light armored vehicles destroyed, with no figures provided for support vehicles. The reported personnel casualties were approximately 3,000 killed in action, more than 3,500 wounded in action, and over 1,100 missing in action, resulting in a total number of nearly 7,600 casualties. These estimates offer an overview of the significant losses suffered by the 5th Guards Tank Army during the intense Battle of Prokhorovka in the disastrous July of 1943. But who truly won the battle? This remains complicated. There is an ongoing debate about the significance and outcome of the Battle of Prokhorovka. While it can be seen as a tactical victory for the Soviet forces, it does not constitute an operational triumph. The extensive destruction of Soviet tanks resulted in a temporary degradation of the 5th Guards Tank Army's offensive power, but the Germans were unable to capture Prokhorovka or achieve a breakthrough into open ground. Although the massive Soviet armored assault on July 12th failed to annihilate the 2nd SS Panzer or force the Germans onto the defensive, the attacking German units were fatigued and their advance was halted. Neither the 5th Guards Tank Army nor the 2nd SS Panzer Corps achieved their objectives for the day, although the Germans were still successful in defending that day. In general, the battle is often considered a tactical success for the Germans due to the substantial losses inflicted on Soviet armor. However, despite this, there was no decisive German advance in Prokhorovka. With the conclusion of Operation Citadel, the strategic initiative definitively passed to the Red Army. The Battle of Prokhorovka thus stands as a complex and multifaceted episode in the broader context of the Eastern Front, marked by successes and limitations for both German and Soviet forces. During Operation Citadel, Waffen-SS units claimed to have destroyed an impressive total of 1,149 enemy tanks, along with 459 anti-tank guns, 85 aircraft and 47 pieces of artillery. Under the command of SS Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser, they also captured 6,441 Soviet soldiers. From a tactical perspective, these figures might seem like a significant achievement. However, from the Soviet perspective, the Battle of Kursk represented a resounding strategic victory. The Soviet defensive lines, designed with multiple layers of resistance, successfully contained the German advance and thwarted the enemy's plans for deep penetration. This outcome prevented the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS from exploiting their blitzkrieg tactics, stopping them from advancing in open terrain, executing encirclements, or destabilizing the Soviet rear. Despite this, the possibility of delivering a devastating blow to the 2nd SS Panzer Corps faded. Although Prokhorovka has historically been portrayed as a severe defeat for Germany, subsequent analyses indicate that it was, in fact, a very costly day for the Soviet forces. Combat reports and daily logs from the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, preserved on microfilms in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., suggest that the Germans were close to achieving a decisive breakthrough on the southern flank of the Kursk salient. According to Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, Prokhorovka could have been a German victory thwarted by decisions made outside the battlefield. Despite local successes and the casualties inflicted, the battle marked the end of German hopes of regaining the initiative on the Eastern Front, sealing the course of the war in that region toward a prolonged retreat. As a lesser-known curiosity of the Eastern Front, German combat medics, including those from the Waffen-SS, were armed and did not wear the Red Cross armband. This decision was not casual. Both the Soviets and the Germans often intentionally shot at medics tending to the wounded on the front lines. Throughout the 20th century, the principle of immunity for medical personnel was consistently violated, which is why many armies chose to arm their medics, abandoning the symbolic neutrality that once protected Red Cross personnel. A particularly striking scene took place in the days leading up to the Battle of Prokhorovka in July 1943. In it, a Waffen-SS Panzer Grenadier, armed with an MP-40, offers water from his canteen to a wounded Soviet soldier, while in the background, a T-34 model 1943 burns. The photograph, captured by war correspondent Max Buschel, captures that rare moment when humanity briefly breaks through amid the destruction. The final result of the battle was devastating. Tens of thousands of wounded and dead were scattered throughout the Kursk salient, left without medical attention. In the midst of the chaos, many were abandoned to their fate, suffering without assistance. The ferocity of the combat and the mutual dehumanization between both sides made it impossible to uphold any humanitarian norms.